This podcast will end in 4 more episodes without your support. To help it continue from $0.25 or $1 an episode, visit patreon.com/servingworlds. The Rundown, Part 21, a Farlost story by John Miro.
Twilight fell upon the darkening road. I found myself again alone. Street lights went out by 1, by 2, by 3. Now reveled in the shadows that had grown. Yes, I reveled in the darkness I had known.
System Guard Liaison Officer Nic Tyzan stood with his back pressed up against the window of the food bus, overwhelmed by the sights and sounds. At least 50 sentients yelled and shouted and laughed and bustled and ate in the confined space of the converted passenger carrier, currently flying sedately through Little Terra toward the pier. On his left, Oscanon's booming laughter was transmitted to him through his ears and the window they both leaned against. It sounded like the roar of a happy, slightly tipsy earthquake. To his right, the noxious smell of a laughing, farting manta mixed with the musky animal scent of his tumbler friend. The manta was chewing a carcass of some kind, and Donald wasn't sure if it was bouncing on its plate because the food bus wobbled through the air or because it was still alive. His tumbler friend's circular exoskeleton was small for its race, made up of smooth and painted hexagonal sections, and his plate was as tidy as Usher's beard. Every time its snout reared out of the protective webbing beneath its exoskeleton to spear its meal with its serrated teeth and tripart black tongue with pink spots, however, Tyzan shuddered. Consequently, Donald's plate of whatever Locklaw Police Inspector Nicodemus Usher had bought him remained untouched. The press, heat, and commingled stink of the various species didn't have a similar effect on the inspector's eating, however. Tyzan watched as Usher brought something wrapped in a fragrant flatbread to his lips. The lean, black-skinned human ate with gusto, and without spilling a drop on that well-trimmed beard, as the traveling restaurant banked and slowed to a not-quite stop. Half a dozen humans and Scanon jumped down onto the roof of a building, then the food bus picked up speed again. Usher balanced easily, enjoying his meal despite the chaos all around him. Donald did his best to hide his emotions and his nausea, but Usher's lips still curled, and his eyes twinkled knowingly as he saluted Donald over his half-eaten wrap. His brother would be laughing right alongside Usher if he were here. Of course, the system guard had many non-human citizens, but the ranks served in units made up of individual species. He'd been housed, fraternized, socialized, and fed among humans his whole rescued life. All that time it had seemed strange to him that the guard welcomed all but kept their contributions separate. That dichotomy was probably what had led to his current choice of service. His heart and mind may have embraced the foreign cultures he worked with as a liaison officer for the system guard, but his stomach still preferred the vat-bred meat and veg common in the safe-tasting 3 squares the guard served its officers. That was one of the worst parts of their annual vacations together. Both brothers loved traveling far and wide, but they were polar opposites on the subject of menu choice. Sala would always find the strangest places to eat and taunt Donald into trying the strangest foods available. His brother would have loved this food bus. Probably he would have liked the stubborn Locklaw cop sitting across from him, too. Donald could almost appreciate the loyalty Usher had shown, getting out of his hospital bed, leaving Donald in holding, and beelining it straight to his partner's widow before doing anything else. But Sala was dead, and the fleeting smile died on Donald's face under the weight of that death, and the weight of his orders, and the weight of Nick Usher's distrust. "Inspector, why are we wasting time sitting here when Roland Bird got away?" Usher's words were a growl. Roland Bird got clean away from the pier. Every blind spot our sensors don't cover have been crossed off in person by unis and detectives. Usher eyed Donald's full plate. "Didn't your mother ever tell you not to let your food—" It was Donald's turn to interrupt. "I never knew my mother." A gentle look appeared on Usher's face. "You should watch your blood sugar," he said in a friendly tone. "You're getting snippy." Donald opened his mouth, but stopped himself from speaking. Instead, he picked up his own wrap and took a decent-sized bite. His mouth instantly watered. He tasted meat, crisp vegetables, savory spice, not too spicy, just enough to accentuate the other flavors. He chewed, nodded, and took another bite. The food bus made 2 more bumpy pickups as the police officers ate in silence. "Did you know your father?" Usher finally asked between bites. Donald saw something on the man's face that disarmed him and decided to answer. "No father either, and no brother, technically. Sala and I grew up together." He found himself completing the story. "We kept each other alive in a slaver mine in the winter belt." Usher stayed silent. Donald nodded as he chewed another bite, appreciating that the man knew how to listen. "The guard got us out, schooled us, offered us both a place, and we took it." Still, Usher nodded silently, surprising Donald. He was pretty sure that was the first opportunity the Lock cop had passed up on to shit on the guard. Instead, the man turned and signaled a Manta waiter for more food. Donald didn't argue. Once he started feeding his stomach, it demanded more. His sandwich disappeared, and the next one did too before either of them surfaced for conversation again. Usher dabbed his lips with his napkin. Donald could see him turning something over in his mind and making a decision. "My dad worked on the pier and the sky roads before the guard tore them down," he shared. "He flew defense sorties in the Civil War and then got in with the unions, back when they were just starting up." Donald nodded. He knew all about unions. When a union started, it wanted safe working conditions, fair pay from the buyers and sellers they made rich. That would have been the kind of union Usher Sr. would have had to fight for. Donald respected the early days of unions, before their own leadership became the fat cats that sold their membership out to become rich themselves. He kept that opinion to himself, washing it down with a swig of what had turned out to be lightly fermented alcohol. He took a deeper swallow. The meal agreed with him far more than he'd expected it would. Usher flashed a smug grin. "Pretty good, huh?" Instead of Usher, it could just as easily have been Donald's brother sitting across from him, smiling a stupid "I told you so" kind of smile. "No sibs for me either," Donald said. "The tears killed my mother, and my father never remarried." He took a swig of his own drink. "He left me Willer, though. Sometimes she feels like family. My only family now Pesh is gone. And Jane." Usher's face pinched with pain, or perhaps regret, but he shook his head, leaving the words unfinished. Donald had been briefed on the Usher family history, and he sympathized with the pain of losing a partner. Pesh had been Usher's partner for almost 2 years. Jane must mean Jane Kelly, the partner before Pesh, the one drummed off the force for conspiracy to hide a medical condition that left her unable to serve. She'd been stripped of rank and jailed after some on-duty accident. That kind of treason would have meant execution in the Guard. Jane Kelly was fortunate she'd only been drummed out of uniform and tossed in a cell. Willer had been an interesting detail, even before Usher had flown the ship like a spear right through the hijacked cargo craft used to kill his partner, Pesh, and free Roland Bird, a feat the inspector had accomplished while holding on against storm force winds outside the safety of Lochlaw's city wall and hundreds of miles above the surface of Casti. His priorities might be mixed up, but Donald chalked that up to being the product of his decadent environment and admitted his respect for Usher's actions. "You went above and beyond trying to stop Bird." Usher shrugged off the words. "I have to do better next time." He stared across the table, meeting Usher's eyes. "We'll have to do better." Donald was again impressed by Nick Usher. He had zero love for the Guard. He'd been taught to hate Tyzan's kind since childhood, but all the same, he proved himself better than his teachers and accepted Tyzan's help. "We'll have to do better," Usher agreed. Tyzan lifted his glass in a silent toast. His jaw set as if he wasn't comfortable with it, but game to try. Usher raised his glass and tapped Tyzan's. In silent agreement not to ruin their first cordial exchange, Both men dug into their meals again. Nic wiped his mouth, dropped the napkin on his empty plate, and stepped away from the table. "Our stop," he called to Tyzan, who weaved elegantly between their table and the Skanen beside him. The Skanen stopped in the middle of his sentence to watch the big human move. Even with all foreign insignia removed and a jacket over top his uniform tunic, the Skanen could sense there was something dangerous about the guard officer. Watching from the open door as Tyzan approached, waiting courteously for an old woman to cross his path, Nic had to admit it wasn't his manners. Tyzan was soft-spoken, considerate, patient. His facial expressions ranged from neutral to good-humored to intense, but he never radiated malice, as some cops got in the habit of. It was the measured way he moved, Nic decided. He looked well-trained. He moved like a weapon, even if he acted like a Boy Scout. Survival instinct would warn any sentient to steer clear of Tyzan. Deciding to have a bit of fun, Nic stepped out the open window without warning the guard officer. He grabbed the bottom of the door to slow his fall and landed lightly, 3 meters down, at a jog. He absorbed the forward momentum the food bus had lent him with a few steps. The food bus had brought them over the Terminator line cast by the sunward side of the 2-kilometer-high city wall looming overhead. Glow panels, lights, and even open flames were coming on in Piertown. There was a steady stream of foot traffic, a dozen or more workers on this block alone. Tyzan was beside him by the time he'd slowed himself to a walk. Nic had never even heard him drop. Even expecting graceful movement, Nic was surprised. Tyzan turned sideways to let 2 school-age girls absorbed in their conversation pass between himself and Nic, then asked, "What are you hoping to find on Willer, Inspector?" Nic shrugged, eyes moving by force of habit to scan the block ahead. "Willer's got eyes and ears that aren't tied into city systems. Seeing as it literally went through that Underwood cargo hauler, it might have grabbed some data that city sensors couldn't scrape." He looked over his shoulder and saw Tyzan's lips press into a flat line. "Bet that sounds weird to an SG cop, but in Locklaw, even when you trust the law, you don't bend over for it." "It's a healthy reaction to living in a corrupt society," Tyzan agreed in his quiet, infuriatingly superior-sounding tone. Nic laughed. "You ever bend a law?" He held his fingers up just a hair's breadth apart. "Just a little?" "Of course not," Tyzan said in exactly the same tone, but Nic caught the hint of a smile, and both men chuckled. "Anyway, Willer's old. I mean old. A Link-grown design probably predates the first Link ship arrival in Farlost. My grandfather salvaged her and, covered her up with the wreck of a human ship." He could guess Donald's next question, and got ahead of it. Gramps was a smuggler. Also one of the first wave of resistance on Locklaw. He paid off who he had to, and he did some favors he didn't like, but it let him keep Willer, and smuggle out some folks the Tears would have turned into dragon kibble. And by the time the Civil War was over, anyone who flew sorties defending the city got to keep what they flew. No questions asked. He looked over at Tyzan, letting his eyes fall a little further back and scanning the way they'd come out of the corner of his eye. "What, no sermon against the evils of corruption or decadence or whatnot?" Back behind the giggling schoolgirls, Nic spotted a Skanen and 2 modded humans, their exoskeleton making them almost as tall as the insectoid alien. He recognized them from the food bus. They must have gotten off after Nic and Donald and doubled back. "I know what the people of the Sky Cities endured under the dragons and their tears, Inspector," Tyzan said. "I come from a place just as cruel." The guard officer stepped in front of Nic, eyes lazily wandering past Nic's shoulder before coming back to his face. Tyzan's hand flashed between them and held up 2 fingers. Nic nodded. Things were about to get interesting. "Doesn't it make you angry?" Tyzan said, his voice louder and rougher, his eyes alight. "Politicians subverting the law that's supposed to protect everybody? Is this the law that you say is so much better than System Guard rule? Sure, it pisses me off seeing people take." Nic crossed his arms over his chest and raised his voice. "But I'll take the rule of law over the rule of Robeson any day." He pushed under his left shoulder, nudging his holster further, ready to draw his service weapon. 2 more exoskeleton-enhanced thugs were closing in behind Tyzan. "We follow a code," Tyzan growled. "It's drummed into us every day of our lives." He reached out and shoved Nic back a few steps. "You people vote in whoever promises you a safer life at half the price, and then act surprised when they lie to you." "That's it," Nic growled. He reached inside his coat, tugging free the inner lining. Once triggered, it began separating from the jacket and fastening itself to his chest. Nic felt the polymers inside stiffen, expanding into armor plating. "Time you learned some respect." He started pulling the coat off, darting his eyes to check behind Tyzan, then pretending to struggle out of his jacket to take a second and scan behind his own back. The 2 ahead and 3 behind all had their digits in pockets or pouches. In just a few seconds, this would turn into a firefight. You have been listening to The Rundown, a Farlost story, written by John Miro. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Opening music, Everything Is Not What It Appears, kindly provided by Nate Maingard at natemaingard.com. Closing music, Full On, by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. If you like what you hear, you can become a patron and support more stories at patreon.com/servingworlds. Thanks for listening. See you next week.